Chapter 11 in Digital Media. Back to China. We covered China at the end of our last textbook, Media Beyond the Western World. But now we focus on it a bit differently. Since we've talked about China before, we're not going to talk about Freedom House, we're not going to talk about Reporters Without Borders, Transparency International, we're not going to talk about GDP. We've discussed these things before. This chapter, we're focusing on digital media and how it's affecting political attitudes in China. And then we're zeroing in on the digital realm that China is creating today. All right, but first, what does this chapter really focus on? Are things changing politically in China? And specifically, is economic liberalization, the idea that China over the past 30 years has made their economy more capitalistic than communistic. I mean, it's not completely capitalistic by no means, but the fact that they have transitioned some, they've liberalized some of their economy. Is that freedom in the economy also leading to a desire for political liberalization and political freedoms? So that's what we're going to focus on, and in particularly, the authors focus on how increases in online news consumption affect a few different things. Generally, political attitudes towards the government, and then also internal political efficacy. You know, how you feel about the government and the government's responsiveness to you, and your ability to understand what government is actually doing. So that's what we're focusing on today. So what do our authors find? As more people in China are using the internet, as more of them are consuming news online, they find something very interesting, first off, that those increases are leading to a decrease in the trust in the government in China. Right? That's pretty big, right? For any type of government, democratic, hybrid, or authoritarian. So, decrease in trust in the government is taking place because of rise of internet and online news consumption. But also we're seeing increases in internal political efficacy in China. Specifically netizens. Now, I know today not many people know this word netizen, but this used to be a really big word in the late 90s and early 2000s when the internet was getting big. So this means amongst those who use the internet, they're becoming more knowledgeable. They're understanding how politics in China work. Perhaps that really is the causal mechanism that is leading to this decrease in trust in the government. But their third finding, and maybe even the most interesting one, depending on your perspective, they find that these increases in online news consumption and internet use does not lead to an increase in a desire for democracy. It doesn't. It's not a significant factor. Now, putting all these things together, how important are these findings in the context of China as the country that it is? Well, okay, so more and more people are going online, consuming online news, and more they don't trust government. Does this mean that people are likely to rise up and overthrow the Chinese Communist Party? Likely not. Okay, so as far as regime change or revolution, that finding probably isn't as relevant. What about thinking about democracy? Is this an important finding, that Chinese people tend not to be worried about democracy? Well, first off, you have to wonder. When you're surveying Chinese citizens, when they are taught in school and as adults, when we ask them about what democracy is, do they know democracy by the same definition that we do? Do they learn the same concepts that we do? If the answer is no, then the meaning behind this finding is something totally different than the implications we would take away from it. So that's something we would have to think about as well. And what's more, whenever you think about this in total, you're thinking about the possibility for change in China. Is there a possibility for change? Most definitely. But Chinese government, they have been able to accomplish something that very few authoritarian regimes have. They have been extremely economically successful. Granted, we all know if you look at GDP per capita and if you look at Gini index with income inequality, there's still large portions of their population that are impoverished. However, they have taken a lot of those people out of poverty. China has become quite successful economically. And you have to think, what's more important to people? Democracy or quality of your day-to-day life? And if an authoritarian regime can increase your quality of a day-to-day life, are you really worried about democracy? Regardless of the findings and the implications behind them, something very interesting that the authors bring into this conversation about China is the digital divide. And what they tell us is that most people who are online are between the age of 18 and 40, they're college educated, and they live in larger cities or urban areas. These are three of the biggest parts of the digital divide. There's 3 of the 6. The implications are that the digital divide knows no bounds via regime type. It doesn't matter if you're democracy, hybrid, or authoritarian, that the internet and the things that block human beings from using it and interacting with the world, with politics, they're the same variables around the world. Now this is huge. This means we can add this to the list of generalizations about 200 or so countries. A list that is extremely, extremely, extremely small that we can say exists in all countries in the world. This is big. If you look at the map, you'll see that the divide is also centrally located around the East Coast. Beijing, Hong Kong, Macau, Shanghai, your largest metropolitan areas that are on the East Coast by the sea. That's also the population divide, too. Over the past few years, China, for the first time ever, has become a majority urban country, hovering somewhere around 55% of the population now live in urban centers, mostly on the East Coast. And those are the people with internet access. This is big. So what are the real-world implications of China and the internet, of the findings of this chapter, of the digital divide slowly being eroded in China, as it is slowly being eroded everywhere? Well, first off, the findings are important. As internet domestication increases in China, it is likely to lead to more and more of an open conversation and pressure on government. However, the Chinese Communist Party is entrenched into everyday life in the country. It is highly unlikely that they will be overthrown, but rather the opportunity for change will likely come from within the government itself. You see, although we call China a one-party system, CCP, the only party allowed, within the Chinese Communist Party itself, there are divisions. There are hardliners versus softliners. There are Maoists. There are those who follow Xi Jinping. And there are slothliners who believe in something a little less extreme. The conversation between those groups within the party does provide an opportunity for change. But it is likely that change has to come from within the government itself and not from outside of the government. So where is internet domestication in China right now? Right now it's somewhere around 59%. Somewhere around 129 million people in China have internet access. But there's about 1.4 billion people in China. China has more people online using the internet than any country in the world. And yet their internet domestication rate is only 59%. This says, as an online market for media corporations and for tech industries, China is still very much in its infancy. If you do bring in the conversation about their GDP per capita and about percentage of their population that live in rural areas that are impoverished, what happens whenever they are no longer impoverished? What happens when their internet domestication goes from 59 to somewhere around, let's say, where the US is, between 85 and 89%? It means the Chinese market and its value booms. and becomes enormous. The dynamics of the world stage could most certainly change as internet domestication increases in China. And it's likely that those world dynamics will change before we see the Chinese Communist Party change. But I'm curious, there's some other things that we should talk about too, like the Great Firewall of China, the fact that China is now exporting its authoritarian internet. They have a Chinese version of YouTube. They have a Chinese version of WhatsApp. They have a Chinese version of Google. They're exporting these things. And then lots of people, well, you can get around authoritarian censorship with VPNs. Hello, Great Fire Cannon of China. What is this, you may say? The Great Fire Cannon of China is something that is far less talked about, and we haven't mentioned it yet, and I didn't mention it to you for a very specific reason. China has found a way to penetrate VPNs. And what's more is they have banned unofficial, unapproved VPNs in the country. So it means if you're in China using a VPN, their government has the capability to penetrate that VPN and find your actual IP address. Social scores have started exporting out of beta versions into real-life versions, to where you are scored in the Chinese society for how good of a citizen you are. If you get good scores, you get privileges to travel, to restaurants, to hotels. You get poor scores, you don't get that access. You don't get those privileges to travel, to fine dine, to go to good hotels, to go to sporting events. We've seen increases in vocational education camps. Let's call them what they are. Internment camps for minorities and the Uyghurs in the West and the Muslim population of China. The implications that if you put all those things together, China's blocking the outside world's internet. China is censoring its own internet. China is penetrating VPNs. China is putting social scores on its own population, and if people get low enough social scores, they might be sent to these re-education camps. And China is the second most successful economy in the world, and they have the potential to grow much, much larger. But what do you think? Those things are not destined to happen. And right now, with what's going on in the world, things could change like that. So you tell me in the forums, where do you think China is going with all the information we've just provided you?